My name is Abdul Razack Gurnah, and today I'm going to be talking about Indian Ocean journeys. On the screen there is the Mappamondo of Fra Mauro, which is dated 1448-1460. Here's a description of the original Venetian Mappamondo, which is held in the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. Nearly 6 feet in diameter, painted on parchment glued to wood panels, the circular map is mounted in a heavy square frame hanging in its own room and is usually covered by a curtain to protect it from the light. When the curtain is drawn aside, one sees a rich abundance of colors and detail. Ships sailing on seas rippled with blue and white, innumerable tiny castles mounted on hills, rivers winding through the land, irregularly shaped islands scattered in the sea, in addition to thousands of place names. The image is covered with 200 descriptive texts, sometimes mounted on scrolls that are pasted onto the surface. It's a map of the world, but it's upside down. That looks a little bit more familiar. This is before it was confirmed that there was a way around Africa. Portuguese ships had just about got to West Africa. So you can see from the map that so far as that area, so far as West Africa and that bulge and the going in, that is accurate. But the rest of it is speculative. And you remember the description of the detail of it. This is the bits of text that are contained, that are covered. The map is covered with bits of text and the representation of ships and rivers and towns and so on. The usual theory is that the map was commissioned by the King of Portugal shortly before 1450 and was produced for him in around about 1457, 1459. Recent discoveries suggest that the Portuguese was a copy of a map which was commissioned by the Republic of Venice itself a little earlier, around about 1448. Fra Mauro lived on one of the islands in the Venetian lagoon called Murano, and he made his map without stirring from there. In fact, the convent in which he worked is still there in Murano and is still working as a convent. He made his map without stirring from Murano, from this little island in the Venetian lagoon, basing the map on information he collected from other maps and from informants. The King of Portugal's interest in the map was to do with his state's aggressive search for a route to the Indian Ocean by rounding Africa. Fra Mauro's map explores the credibility of this search when learned opinion proposed that what we now call the Indian Ocean was landlocked. So, in defense of his sedentary scholarship, Fra Mauro had this to say for himself: "In my time, I have striven to verify the writings by experience through many years' investigation and intercourse with persons worthy of credence who have seen with their own eyes what is faithfully set out above." So what were these writings that he was referring to? With reference to the Indian Ocean, these were certainly Arab and Persian sources. The Arabs in particular were the great sailors of the Western Indian Ocean, at least in part because the monsoon winds favored them particularly and gave them a longer sailing season than the South Asians, say, or indeed the Far Eastern Asians. These sources could have included the 10th century contemporary accounts of a place called Zingba and Zangistan in Al-Masudi's World Encyclopedia, which was called Murj al-Dhahab, the Meadows of Gold, in which he gives an eyewitness account of traveling to the port of Kanbalu in Pemba. There is also Ibn Hawqal, who reports hearsay on Zingba and the anonymous geography Hudud al-Alam, translated as regions of the world, which attempts to locate Zangistan. The philosopher Al-Biruni in 973 in his Chronology of Ancient Nations suggests, I quote, "The sea beyond Sofala of the Zanj was impossible to navigate, and no ship which ventured there had ever returned to give an account of what it had seen. This southern ocean is navigable. It does not form the utmost southern limit of the inhabitable world. On the contrary, the latter stretches still more southward." Al-Biruni believed specifically that there was a sea route around Africa, linking the Atlantic with the Indian Ocean. I quote again, "One has certain proofs of this communication, although one has not been able to confirm it by sight." The usual historian. Remember, this is 973. And remember, Frau Mauro is making his map in 1440s. So something like 500 years before that, there was already speculation, indeed firm speculation, that there was a route around Africa. What these sources demonstrate is that a great deal is known about the Indian Ocean and its archipelago of cultures by the time that Frau Mauro is making his map. Then, in January 1498, Vasco da Gama's ships entered the Indian Ocean and began creeping up the African coast to inaugurate the modern era. By the middle of May, Vasco da Gama and his ships had reached Calicut on the Malabar coast, piloted there by an Arab. In fact, it was an Indian, but an Arab from Malindi. They stayed only briefly, the Portuguese, they stayed only briefly, offending and being offended, and then sailing off after delivering a farewell broadside on the city. It was to be the first of several as the Portuguese slashed and burned their way across the Indian Ocean for the next 100 years. For the Portuguese quickly realized that there was no contestant to their seaborne military power. Trade across the northern Indian Ocean had never been under the military control of any state, and the shock of the Portuguese destruction of all competitors would have seemed like hysterical greed. When da Gama returned to Calicut in 1502, 4 years later, with a hugely increased force, he made the point about Portuguese supremacy with devastating barbarism. Bombarding the town, boarding the ships in the harbor, there were about 20 of them, and mutilating the soldiers by cutting off noses, ears, and hands, and sending a boatload of them back to the Samudra Raja, the king of Calicut, suggesting that he might like to make curry with the pieces. Then he set fire to all the captured ships, with the mutilated sailors still on board. Such events, towns destroyed, populations mutilated and killed, were to be repeated along the coast of Africa, Kilwa, Mombasa, Pate, Faza, and in the Persian Gulf, Muscat, Hormuz, and in Western India. To the surprised ports and cities along the Indian Ocean, it must have seemed as if something demonic had befallen their world. The familiar way of telling the history of the Indian Ocean for the next 500 years is to focus on the activities and increasing control of the European empires. The focus shifted to relations between the three modern European states, the British, the French, and the Dutch, as they jostle for supremacy in the Indian Ocean, soon to be joined by the Germans. It had to wait until the evangelical movements in Europe and the exploration mania to reach a peak before writing conventions for representing the African Indian Ocean littoral were established. These included the orientalizing of the Western Indian Ocean as Arab, backward, and addicted to slaves and the harem. The European evangelist and explorer and later government official had come both to restrain the despotic tendencies of the Arabs and also to succor the Africans. Various forms of these conventions of telling, of describing, can be seen in the memoirs of explorers and bishops, in popular travelogues, and in fiction. In some respects, these conventions still survive. I was born and grew up in Zanzibar, which is one of those little dots along the coastline there, a small island. In the part of town where we lived, which was then called Malindi, the dominant narrative was the sea and the ocean beyond it. From the upstairs window of the house we lived in then, you could see the dockside warehouses and the Dhow Harbour, and beyond that, way out to sea. Many of the people in that part of town lived by the sea. Fishermen, sailors, or less dangerously, merchants who traded the products of the sea. Every year, around November or so, the winds and the currents of the southwest monsoon blew from the Bay of Bengal, that's the dotted line on the map there, blew from the Bay of Bengal across South India and South Arabia along the Somali coast and all the way to Zanzibar. And every year when I was a child, they brought with them dozens and dozens, what felt like hundreds, of dhows from across the ocean, laden with goods to trade, and they all ended up in the dhow harbor in our backyard. There were so many dhows and packed so tightly that sometimes we would see the sailors walk from one boat to another across the harbor. Just recently, I was browsing someone's bookshelf and I noticed a book called Isle of Cloves by F.D. Omani, which was published in 1955. The isle in the title told me that it was likely to be a travel book by a European in the tropics. And of course, cloves was likely to refer to us, because Zanzibar was the world's sort of biggest producer of cloves. So it was without any enthusiasm that I opened the book. It opened on this page, and I thought to myself, I know where that is. If the person taking that photograph had moved slightly that way, that photograph would have included the house in which I was born. So this is very much the area in which I lived and grew up, and etc. Then I saw the caption, Arab Quarter, and I felt that I had been dispossessed of something valuable to see our complicated little world so brutally summarized. But this is what I mean about the convention of telling about these places. The book was published in 1955, and I might have been standing nearby when the picture was taken. In fact, in the background there, you see, I don't know if you can, but in the background there's a group of boys playing. I thought, I could have been one of them playing there. I was just about to start school, and I might have been standing there somewhere. From the look of that crowd, I would guess this was at the time of the Musim. You can see these are people who are probably from Arabia. And I would guess that they were standing around because they'd finished their business and they were waiting for the winds to change. They looked relaxed, bored, and people were probably taking advantage of their presence to set up a small market, selling vegetables and fruit probably. But if you go around that, you can see it's a working area, warehouses, and you can see the table there, which is the kind of impromptu market. But what you can't see from that picture is who lives in this place. And if you did, you would understand the sense of being deprived of something that I described, because there's an Indian family in the house far to the right there. Next to it is the house that was occupied by the director of the Clove Growers Association, who was an Englishman. The building right on the edge there is the local police station, and the police officer was a man called Sergeant Songoro, who was of Somali ancestry. Further around the corner, there's a cafe which is run by a Yemeni man, etc. If you look at the other picture, you'll see its caption says European Quarter. And if you look at the building, it doesn't look like any kind of European building you'll be familiar with. These were the mansions which were built by Arab merchants along the sea, and which, after the British took over, became occupied by the British. What I'm referring to in looking at these captions and commenting on them is the way in which a complicated story is reduced to two little captions which describe them and which fit a view of the world which is polarized and which is clearly, kind of incommensurable one from the other, even if it means usurping other people's cultures and suppressing other cultures in the process of creating a narrative. The Muslim trade was ended by government decree after the revolution in Zanzibar in 1964. The ships were simply turned back and have never come again. The journeys, however, continue. And one of the more remarkable manifestations of this is the spread of Kiswahili. Kiswahili means the language of the coast. And it is well known that it is now the most widely spoken African language. But it is less well known that it is spoken as a first language across the ocean. In Oman and the Gulf cities, where whole districts are enclaves of people from the ocean's western shores. But these are only remnants of what was there before. And I too, like others who have written about this, like Amitav Ghosh in An Antique Land, I too lament the loss and the dissolution of the centuries of dialogue that had linked these territories. Thank you.